The Bristol Beaufort was one of those aircraft that rarely gets top billing, yet it spent the early years of the Second World War doing some of the most dangerous work that an aircraft could do. It was Coastal Command's principal torpedo bomber during the opening years of the war. It flew over cold seas and hostile harbours to attack warships and shipping with torpedoes, mines, bombs, and on many occasions with a level of optimism that skirted the narrow border that separates heroism from insanity. Now, this will get a much longer video in the future, but I wanted to introduce its history today because I've always had something of a soft spot for it. The Beaufort story begins in 1935, with two different Air Ministry requirements. You had Specification M1535, calling for a shore-based torpedo bomber, and G2435, which asked for a general-purpose land-based reconnaissance aircraft. Multiple manufacturers submitted proposals, among them being Bristol. Avro, Blackburn, Boulton Paul, Bristol, Handley Page, and Vickers each submitted designs for the torpedo bomber, and the reconnaissance aircraft were proposed by Avro, Blackburn, Boulton Paul, and Bristol again, along with Gloucester and Westland. Bristol's initial proposal for the torpedo bomber requirement was the Type 150, which was based on its newest light bomber design, the Bristol Blenheim. The Blenheim was currently undergoing assessment for RAF service, and at the time it was the most modern multi-engine military aircraft in Britain. It made use of all-metal stressed skin, powered gun turrets, split flaps, fully retractable landing gears, and variable pitch propellers. To accommodate its new torpedo bombing requirement, Bristol had to make quite a few changes to the base design of the Blenheim. The cockpit was moved forward by 54 inches, while the dorsal turret was shifted aft, opening up internal space which could accommodate both a torpedo and a new navigator station. As far as I'm aware, no verified drawings of the reconnaissance version survive today, because a smart chap at Bristol noticed rather quickly that the company was essentially doubling its workload for no reason. Leslie Fries, Bristol's deputy chief designer at the time and inventor of the Fries aileron, felt that submitting two different designs would be a waste of resources during a time when the RAF was scrambling to rearm and rearm quickly. Rather than treat these as entirely separate problems, he proposed that Bristol produce one basic aircraft that could fulfill both roles. After all, a torpedo bomber and reconnaissance plane shared several core requirements: good range, incredibly stable handling, observation crews, and the ability to swap out its useful payload, because depending on the mission, recon planes would often carry different types of cameras. Persuaded that he was in the right of things, as most English men of an engineering nature tend to be, he wrote to the Air Ministry, which, after some brief consultations, agreed with his proposal, and their two requirements were combined into one, a new specification slated as Specification 10/36. In a broad nutshell, the new specification called for a maritime patrol bomber that could also be converted for reconnaissance duties. It would be capable of carrying an offensive load of one 1,900-pound torpedo or up to 2,000 pounds of bombs. It would have one forward-firing machine gun controlled by the pilot and ideally two defensive guns in a turret mounted amidships. The aircraft had to be both highly maneuverable but also steady in a dive. Speed when carrying a torpedo was to be 220 miles an hour at 10,000 feet, and in the reconnaissance configuration with 500 pounds of bombs, 200 miles an hour at 5,000 feet. Range with a torpedo was to be 500 miles or 750 miles with an overload of fuel, or with a reduced bomb load of 1,000 pounds, it could achieve a range of 1,000 miles or 1,250 miles with overload fuel. Crew was increased to 4, a point that was insisted upon by the ministry. There would be 2 pilots, one who could also handle navigation, a wireless operator, and one dedicated defensive gunner. The updated design submitted by Bristol to meet this new amalgamated requirement was the Bristol Type 152. Though the Type 150 was already visually distinct from the original Blenheim, the Type 152's forward fuselage was further modified. The original torpedo bomber specification had required that the torpedo was to be carried internally within a bomb bay, But with the addition of a fourth crew member, and the combining of the torpedo bombing and reconnaissance roles, this would have resulted in the aircraft growing far too large. The Air Ministry therefore accepted a compromise. The torpedo would be half exposed, and the fuselage would be enlarged and lengthened to allow the pilot's station to sit above the forward torpedo section. This also helped to free up space for the radio and camera equipment to be installed side by side, just ahead of the midships turret, and it allowed for an unobstructed bomb aiming and navigation station to be installed in the nose. With Bristol's overall design approved, the Air Ministry then made the uncharacteristically prompt decision to order the type into production straight off the drawing board. Now, this was something I mentioned in an earlier video on the Blackburn Botha, as both of these aircraft were originally built to the same specification. But in a nutshell, it was something of a reaction to the growing realization that the newly announced German Luftwaffe actually presented something of a real and growing threat. Thus, construction of the first production aircraft would be accelerated so that it could essentially serve as a prototype, and production of the following aircraft after it was purposefully delayed to allow for last-minute alterations on the production line if needed. The initial production contract was signed in August of 1936. The aircraft was eventually given the name of Beaufort, with the approval and blessing of the Duke of Beaufort, and the, quote, prototype, unquote, flew for the first time in October 1938. Like the Blenheim before it, the Beaufort was built as a twin-engine mid-wing monoplane. It had a span of 57 feet 10 inches, a length of 44 feet 3 inches, and stood 14 feet 3 inches tall. Empty, it would weigh approximately 13,100 pounds, with a maximum takeoff weight initially of approximately 21,200 pounds. The initial production variant, the Beaufort Mark I, would use a pair of Bristol Taurus engines. These were 14-cylinder twin-row radials that put out around 1,130 horsepower. This gave the Mark I a top speed of approximately 260 miles an hour at 5,000 feet. Later on, Australia would become a manufacturer of the Beaufort, which we will get to later, and they would prefer to install the more powerful, American-designed Pratt & Whitney Twin Wasp. Depending on the exact model, these produced around 1,200 horsepower, broadly speaking, and some were also adopted for later British-made Mark II versions of the Beaufort as well. These gave a slight increase in the maximum speed, going up to 265 or 278 miles per hour, sources conflict, which compares somewhat favourably to the 260 mile an hour top speed of the original Taurus-powered versions, though it's not a huge increase overall. Service ceiling, however, was greatly improved, going from around 16,500 feet to 22,500 feet. The defensive armament varied, but generally consisted of 1 or 2 rifle-caliber machine guns on the dorsal turret, and a pair in a flexible gimbal mount on the glass nose. As intended, the main ordnance was in the form of an 18-inch torpedo in its partially closed bay, but the Beaufort could also carry up to 2,000 pounds of bombs. A major hurdle in the development of the Beaufort early on was the persistent engine overheating of the prototype and early production models. Early cooling arrangements on the Bristol Taurus engines proved inadequate, and the close-fitting cowlings, which greatly improved streamlining, also contributed to overheating problems that were never fully solved. Extra cooling gills and improved oil cooling arrangements helped, but the engine remained a constant source of anxiety, particularly for an aircraft expected to fly long distances over water patrols and eventually to serve in hot climates. The efforts to solve this overheating issue severely impacted early production, and the first Beauforts intended for RAF service arrived over a year after the prototype had first flown. The original timeline was only meant to be a matter of months, if that. Because of this, the war had already arrived by the time the first Beauforts were being delivered, with No. 22 Squadron taking first delivery in January of 1940. As soon as they had enough on strength, the unit began conducting torpedo attack training, but due to a shortage of torpedoes, and the complicated learning curve encountered when transitioning from the old, slow biplane Vickers Wildebeest to the new, fast and sleek Beaufort, the early sorties flown by many Beauforts were mine-laying missions. These would unfortunately show that the overheating of the Taurus engine had not been fully solved, leading to several engine failures and the loss of Wing Commander F.P. Don as he was returning from a mine-laying mission across the Channel. The death of the commanding officer of the wing caused all Beauforts to be temporarily grounded for engine modifications. These would be successful and the Beaufort would eventually return to service in August. An early claim to fame for the Beaufort came on the 7th of May 1940, when it became the first RAF aircraft to drop a 2,000-pound bomb during attacks against the Friesan Islands. In fact, the Beaufort was quite capable at bombing. Until Vickers Wellingtons began using the 4,000-pound high-capacity blockbuster bomb, the Beaufort could carry any RAF offensive weapon then available. Indeed, for much of its career, the Beaufort would often find itself dropping bombs rather than torpedoes, and in many cases over the European theatre at least, this was done with level bombing rather than low-altitude strikes. But regardless of what weapon it was carrying, for the early parts of the war, the Beaufort was often employed against naval targets. Over the course of 1940, it was increasingly drawn into anti-shipping attacks and strikes against major German warships. On the 21st of June, Beauforts would attack the battleship Scharnhorst, and this was followed by other successful raids on German shipping, including the torpedoing of multiple large supply ships, some in excess of 6,000 tons displacement. Perhaps the most famous sortie of a single Beaufort took place on the 6th of April 1941. Following air raids on the harbour of Brest, the German battleship Gneisenau had been moved out from its dry dock, owing to a distressing proximity to an unexploded bomb. But now that she was afloat in the water, a torpedo attack could be used to sink her. And, as a result, Beauforts from No. 22 Squadron, the most experienced squadron with the type, were tasked with this attack. Now, the full story of this raid will be covered in the deep dive that I am planning on the Beaufort, but to cut a long story short, it was madness. With the port defences and her own weapons, Gneisenau was protected by over 1,000 anti-aircraft guns of varying calibre. The shape of the harbour meant a low attack run flying over the mole, also bristling with guns, and then a very, very narrow time window to release the torpedo. Then, after that, pulling out from the attack run, the Beauforts would be lucky not to slam into the rapidly rising hillside that is directly behind the harbour. 6 Beauforts were tasked to carry out this mission. 3 were to carry bombs, 3 were to carry torpedoes. The bombers would clear any defensive torpedo nets, and the 3 torpedo bombers would attack the Gneisenau. Now, unfortunately for the brave men involved, the raid got off to an awful start. Due to wet weather, a not uncommon occurrence in England, the bombing aircraft got bogged down, and then, due to sea mist and fog, the torpedo bombers had to conduct their attacks independently, lest they risk crashing into each other on the final approach to attack the battleship. Leading the trio was Flying Officer Kenneth Campbell. To press home a torpedo attack in a defended harbour was hazardous enough, but to do it at extremely low altitude, flying solo against such defences was bravery of the highest order. Skimming over the waves at an altitude of just 30 feet, Campbell pointed his Beaufort into the harbour. He shot over the defending flagships at mast-level height and dropped his torpedo at a range of approximately 500 yards. Moments after releasing his torpedo, Campbell's Beaufort would be shot down, and himself and the other 3 crew members would all be killed. Kenneth Campbell was awarded a posthumous Victoria Cross for his bravery, and the attack was not merely heroic. Campbell's torpedo is recorded as having torn a hole roughly 40 feet across in Gneisenau, causing damage severe enough to put the ship out of action for several months. So this was not one of those noble but futile gestures that we often read about. It was actually an extraordinarily brave attack that also achieved exactly the sort of result that Coastal Command had hoped its torpedo bombers might actually deliver against major German capital ships. Both the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau would face Bristol Beauforts again as they fled through the Strait of Dover during the Channel Dash on the 12th of February 42, but this time both ships would escape. Beauforts would continue to take part in several major attacks throughout the year, including an attack on the Prinz Eugen, with 3 torpedoes reportedly striking home, and the Beauforts would also operate out of Malta to harass enemy shipping in the Mediterranean theatre. By late 1942 and mid-1943, Mediterranean service had become one of the Beaufort's main areas, with aircraft of 39 Squadron and other units working from bases like Lucca in harsh conditions and covering long distances on each sortie. Some Beauforts were also pushed farther afield into the Indian Ocean and the adjacent areas. There, the aircraft's range and payload still made it useful for maritime reconnaissance and anti-shipping duties, even if it was no longer an especially modern machine by this time. Now, aside from its RAF career, the Beaufort, of course, became an important aircraft on the other side of the world in Australia. Australia had ordered the type before things had heated up in the Pacific, as it were, but once Japan entered the war, the Beaufort became an important local strike aircraft for the Royal Australian Air Force. Instead of just assembling British-built aircraft, Australia ended up adapting the design to local industry and building Beauforts of its own. In service, Australian Beauforts were used across the Southwest Pacific in exactly the sort of anti-shipping and strike roles that the design had originally been intended for. They attacked Japanese shipping, operated around New Guinea, Timor, and the islands to the north, and became one of the Royal Australian Air Force's principal twin-engined offensive aircraft during the first half of the Pacific theatre. What makes this especially interesting is that the Beaufort was, by then, already fast approaching obsolescence in British frontline service. In Australia, by contrast, it remained highly relevant because it was available in numbers, it could carry a serious weapon load, and it could be produced domestically. This was the big one for the Aussies. It gave the aircraft a much longer and more important service life than a purely RAF-centered story would usually suggest. Now, returning to the RAF, by late 1943 and into 44, the Beaufort was steadily disappearing from frontline RAF service. Surviving aircraft were increasingly pushed into training and secondary duties as the type became obsolete in combat service. In Australia, the Beaufort lingered on much longer. There, the aircraft's usefulness did not end neatly with the end of the Second World War. Some Beauforts continued in secondary roles, and a few found themselves in the sort of post-war employment that would have seemed rather undignified to the men who had once taken them against flak ships and German battleships. Among the more memorable examples of this post-war use was the Beaufort's employment in 1946 for spraying insecticides to help curtail a truly massive plague of grasshoppers. In total, just under 2,000 Beauforts were eventually produced, just over 700 of which were built in Australia. Several incomplete examples survive today, and there is even a Beaufort in the RAF Museum in London, which was assembled from a few different airframes over the years and restored to display condition. There's also at least 2 more under active restoration down here in Australia, and 1 under active restoration in the United States. The Beaufort may not be as famous as many of its contemporaries, but it was a solid workhorse that struck fear into the hearts of Axis shipping from the North Sea to the far reaches of the Pacific. It would be replaced by a variant of an aircraft that it directly inspired, the Beaufighter. Now, I've covered the Beaufighter in brief already, and there is a much longer deep dive video currently in the works, but that will be a story for another day. As always, thank you all so much for watching, and a big thank you of course to the Patreon supporters and YouTube members whose support helps to keep the channel going, and an extra special thank you to our Wing Commander tier supporters, our highest tier members across both platforms. Now, if you've got any questions, feel free to leave them in the pinned comment down below. I promise I do actually attend to them eventually. And if you're new here, or you just stumbled onto this video, I'd encourage you to take a look through the channel's back catalogue, as there are plenty of shorter videos, longer videos, deep dives, guides, etc., and other random bits of aviation history waiting for you. And if you enjoy what you see and you'd like to see more, please consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. But for now, that is all for today. Thank you once again for all your continued support, and I'll catch you all next time. Goodbye.